Hello, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you would expect from our title. My name is Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And I guess I want to open this episode with a thank you to everyone who actually listens to this show. Megan and I learned this week because Spotify now has a Wrapped for creators that, like, apparently this show is technically in the top 8% of listening hours or whatever of like all shows on Spotify. Which is crazy to us, right? Like, how is this possible, right? Like, it must just be the case that, like, basically every podcast out there, like, nobody listens to it, or it gets, like, 1 or 2 listeners. But yeah, that was, like, an insane thing to learn. Yeah, I sent it to Megan. And Megan, what was your response to that? Let me see if I can go back through our
I don't remember exactly what I said, but I'm sure it was
Let me see.
Some disbelief.
You said completely insane. That was your response.
So we question your sanity, but thank you for your listening time.
Yes. And in the interest of allowing your listening time to be productive, Megan, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, Clayton, we are talking about rejecting tax cuts and embracing civic commitment.
All right. Wonder who came up with that title. Couldn't have been me. Maybe it was me. I don't know.
I do want to say I asked you to do this episode specifically in the context of debates over reducing property tax payments, but it seems as though we've kind of expanded the concept a little bit more. So I'm interested to see where we go with this.
Yes. Well, we figured, like, we might still at some point in the future do a more in-depth episode on property taxes. But we figured
I got a whole rant.
Yeah, we figured that there were going to be too many housing episodes in a row if I did this just on property taxes. So I reoriented a little bit around just rejecting sort of the broad, like, anti-tax sentiment, right? That sort of prevails among a lot of people these days. So we're gonna talk about property taxes in here, but it's not going to be the only thing that we're going to talk about in here. So I think, just to start us off, we've all probably heard, or at least I imagine most of our audience has heard, about the much reported upon decline in top marginal tax rates in the United States. Like, you've probably seen the graph from like one or more sources, right? The one that shows that, well, tax rates went really, really up, and then they've been falling, and Reagan cut them a lot, and all of that. And so, yes, this is true. This is a true fact about the world, that in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the top marginal tax rate, at least starting in sort of 1933, right? Like, starting with FDR, right? Starting with trying to like recover from the Great Depression. The top marginal tax rate was upwards of 80%. For every dollar that you made over a certain amount, you'd only get to keep like a very small percentage of it, right? The top marginal tax rate ever was during the Second World War. It was 93%.
I want to make sure we hammer home the concept of marginal tax rates.
Yes. Okay. Do you want to do marginal tax rates, or should I do marginal tax rates?
Either one of us could do it, but I think that there is a widely held and kind of wild misconception that if your tax rate is 90%, you are paying 90% taxes on every dollar you make in income. And that's just not true.
Yes, this is not how a marginal tax rate system works. Basically, to make a long story short, the way that a marginal tax rate system works is that only your income above the threshold is taxed at the higher rate. So let's just consider, like, this is not the way that the tax system actually works. There's more tax brackets than this.
We're simplifying.
But for simplifying it, let's say that there are 2 tax brackets. There's a 10% tax bracket for everything under $30,000, and there's a 25% tax bracket for everything over $30,000. The way that a lot of people erroneously think that it works is that if you make more than $30,000 a year, you pay taxes on all of your income at 25%. That's not how it works. What happens is that every single dollar up to $30,000 is taxed at the 10% rate, and then only every dollar above $30,000 is taxed at the 25% rate. So, for instance, if you made $30,001, your take-home pay would not be 30,001 times 0.75. It would be 30,000 times 0.9, so 27,000, right? Plus 1 times 0.75. So you'd make $27,000.75 after taxes. Not the way smaller amount of money that people think that you would be making. And this is important for a number of reasons, but primarily it's sort of the inverse of the benefits cliff that Megan and I have talked about before. You don't want to have this system where making one additional dollar actually makes you a lot poorer because you get like way more of your income taken away in taxes. So that's the way that a marginal tax rate system works. Only the amount of money over the threshold is taxed at that higher rate. In practice, of course, during the 1940s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, very few people actually paid taxes into those very, very top marginal tax brackets. I think at the time that the 93% tax bracket was instituted, and it only existed for a very short period of time, it applied to a single-digit number of people in the United States, right? That's the kind of how
with the last name of Carnegie or
right?
Rockefeller, or somebody
how
that.
high up there we're talking, right? But so the long story short is, yes, we have this top marginal tax rate. Most people are not paying anywhere close to that top marginal tax rate. But arguably a more important trend is that the effective federal tax rates have fallen for basically all income groups over time. It's not just true with regards to the top marginal tax rate. It's true with regards to basically all tax groups. It's most pronounced for higher income individuals. The example that I have that I've written in my notes is that for families making between $200,000 and $500,000 a year in inflation adjusted terms, those families paid around 24% of their income in federal income tax in 2000, but only about 16.8% of their income in federal income tax in 2020. Whereas a family making $15,000 to $30,000, their tax burden in federal income tax has fallen from just north of 5% to just below 2%. Right? So we've got a 3% decline for poorer folks, but more like an 8%, 9%, 7 or 8% decline for richer families. Now, of course, that doesn't encompass every single type of tax that people pay.
Yeah, we're just talking about federal income taxes here, right?
Federal income tax is only one type of tax. There's payroll taxes, there's other stuff, but that's the case for federal income taxes. Now, of course, not all declines are created equal. There's an argument to be made that those who make less money in the first place should pay fewer taxes, right? Just because the ultimate result of those taxes being higher on poor folks is that it's harder for them to pay, right? They have a less ability to pay. But the ultimate result of all of these tax cuts is that as a whole, the government has less money with which to fund important services. That's sort of the be-all, end-all of tax rates declining. And, we just got another one of these big rounds of tax cuts in the latest Republican budget bill, right? The one that was passed over the summer. And as we've been talking about with regards to these services, that's paid for by cutting hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years in programs primarily intended to benefit poorer Americans. Programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, Medicaid, other things that have been cut, right?
You say over the next 10 years, I'm going to go ahead and just take a wild guess and say that a lot of these cuts are actually set to happen about 5 years from now when perhaps a Democrat might be in charge.
Some of these cuts are not going to start until after the midterms, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that all of them are only starting when the next Democrat or after the next presidential election happens. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly when they're supposed to go into effect.
There's a fair amount of gamesmanship in terms of the timing of service cuts. And so something to just be on the lookout for when you're analyzing legislation at home, as I'm sure you all do, is to think about when certain program changes are going to be implemented and what problems that's going to create and what perceptions that will create for people who are maybe just looking at their pocketbooks.
Yeah. So all of this is happening at the federal level. This is important. People notice this. People know about this. But frankly, all of this is, I would argue, a little bit played out, right? Everybody, or at least everyone in our circles, the people who are listening to this show probably, love to agree that we should tax the wealthy more. Like, the idea that the wealthy are not paying their fair share is like mostly just sort of an article of faith on the left.
I would agree. We saw a whole nother round of this with the New York City mayor's race rhetoric about people are going to leave if someone is elected, and we're still waiting.
We're still waiting.
We're still waiting.
For people
Admittedly,
to
he hasn't taken office yet, so we'll see.
Yeah.
But the wealthy love to say that they will leave wherever is going to tax them heavily to persuade people not to tax them heavily.
Yeah. So these federal trends are troubling, right? They do result in less federal revenue. They result in more federal debt, right? All of that stuff. But that's not actually what I want to spend most of our time talking about today. Instead, I want to talk about how this federal trend is also reflected in a trend in state and local politics that sees wealthier people arguing that their taxes should be cut, at least partly, and some of them are very open and honest about this, because they don't want their taxes going to pay for services that they don't use and don't plan on using, right?
Crazy.
Now, at this juncture, I would like to note that your taxes paying for things that you do not directly benefit from is called living in a society, motherfucker. That's how it fucking works, right? And I could leave it there, right? But there's probably more indeed that we could expound upon here, right?
Yeah, we can get into some detail for sure. But at the basic premise, if you like anything around you, unless you are living in the Unabomber's cabin, you are probably benefiting from the things that you don't think you should be paying for.
Yeah. In one way or another, there's obviously these very like indirect benefits, circuitous benefits. People often don't recognize how they benefit from these things, right? And so they don't want to pay for things that they do not directly benefit from, right? They're not like directly receiving the benefit. For example, one of the big ones here is like paying for schools, right? Through
public
property
education,
taxes,
like
right?
if you don't
People
have
are like, well, I don't have kids in
yeah.
public school, or like I don't plan on having kids in public school, so I shouldn't be required to pay these taxes. Like, first of all, fuck off. It's kids, right? Like, I don't know. Megan, you and I are
that
like...
really does summarize a lot of my politics, by the way. Fuck off, it's kids.
Yeah.
Yes.
But like the broad thing is like there's a lot of people who don't want to do these things because they don't think they're directly benefiting. We'll get into some of those indirect ways you benefit later, and also the sort of more contextualized, like we live in a society pieces. But let's take like a step back and explain sort of how we got here, why this is important to talk about. First and foremost, it's really important to understand that states and cities and other localities, right, like counties, rely on a very diverse revenue mix, right? So the vast majority of federal revenue comes from one form of income tax or another, right? 49% of government revenue is the individual income tax, right? So the federal income tax we were talking about earlier. Another 35% of government revenue is payroll tax, and payroll taxes are earmarked to support specific federal programs, mostly sort of social spending like Medicare or Social Security, right? And then 11% of government revenue comes from corporate income tax. There's like, I think 9% that doesn't account for, or something along those lines. But it's like quite a small percentage of federal revenue that doesn't come from one type of income tax or another. Cities and states rely on a wider variety of taxes and rely much less on income taxes. Only 17 states, for instance, even allow their cities to levy an individual city income tax in the first place. And 9 states out there have no state income tax, none whatsoever. And declines or stagnations in intergovernmental transfers, again, at least partly driven by the aforementioned decrease in tax rates at the federal level, means that states and cities rely mostly on property taxes and on sales taxes, with the biggest single category being property tax at just about 1/3 of state and local revenues. So that's sort of the landscape that we're working with here in the first place, right? Cities, states, counties, they rely on a different mix of revenue than the federal government does. And that means that this revenue stream of various different types is really susceptible to changes in local context, changes in local environments, right? This also has really significant implications for who actually pays for state and local programs and services. So, whereas the United States as a whole has a progressive income tax system, where the more money you make, the higher a percentage of your income you pay in taxes, this isn't always the case at the state and the local level. In fact, it's rarely the case at the state and the local level that the revenue drawn on by states is actually collected in a progressive way. And this is basically because a sales tax is essentially a definitionally regressive tax with respect to income.
And there can be a lot of arguments about this, but I'm very happy to have those arguments with folks.
Yeah. And then property taxes, while they are not quite as definitionally a regressive tax, they often work out that way, where people who have lower incomes live in homes that have a similar value, right? Or at least not as lower of a value of the property as their income is lower relative. Like, there's a lot of relative going on here. But the basic premise here is that the reason that poor folks pay more in sales taxes is because they spend a larger proportion of their income on stuff, right? If you make only, call it $25,000 a year, you're going to spend basically all of that $25,000, right? And more of the money that you spend is going to be subject to sales tax than money that rich people are saving or spending in other ways, in ways that aren't quite as subject to sales tax. And then for property taxes, it's because poorer people, when they own homes at least, have a home that's not, like, in ratio terms, as like less valuable than the homes that richer folks are living in relative to the amount of income that those two groups have as a ratio across them. So, long story short, if you are relying on those types of taxes, if you are relying on a sales tax and property taxes for the bulk of your revenue, rather than on a progressive income tax, you end up taxing poor people more. You just can't really get away from this particular mathematical fact. Now, one of the things that Megan was talking about there, or at least I'm going to surmise this is one of the things that we can have an argument about, is that it is important for all people to have a stake in paying taxes in the community, right? And I think this is a reasonable argument, but at the same time, you shouldn't design a tax system that has poor people paying a higher percentage of their income in taxes than rich people, because they have much less ability to pay taxes in the first place. But this is not what we see in states and in localities. As a result of all of this stuff, all of the aforementioned trickery and the different ways that taxes are assessed, a lot of states that we perceive to be low tax states are really just states that have highly regressive tax systems.
Yeah, somehow Texas has managed to convince everybody it's a low tax state. And I want somebody who doesn't live in Texas but dreams of moving to Texas to ask a Texan friend how much their property taxes are.
Yeah, Texas has crazy high property taxes.
Oh my God.
at least partly because they have no state income tax, right?
Mhm.
They're one of those 9 states we mentioned earlier. To give you a little bit of context here, I'm going to read a list of the 15 states with the highest effective tax rates on their poorest residents. So when we say their poorest residents, for the rest of the episode mostly, we're talking about people who are in the bottom quintile of income. So people who are in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. You ready for this, Megan?
I am.
All right.
I'm so excited.
In order, from 15th worst to the worst, we have Kentucky, Mississippi, Connecticut, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Florida, Rhode Island, Indiana, Washington, Hawaii, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. I would argue that only 3 of those states are states that people broadly think of as being high tax states. If you were to ask like 100 people on the street to name like 5 or 10 states where they thought like the taxes were highest, I think you'd probably only get Washington, Hawaii, and Illinois on that list.
I completely agree. I don't see California on that list.
California is not on that list.
I don't see Massachusetts on that list.
Massachusetts is not on that list.
Get out of town.
I will note that Washington, Hawaii, and Illinois do have pretty high taxes across the board, and there's sort of various reasons for this. We are not going to get into them in this episode, but the upshot of all of this, and the fact that you have lots of these low tax states, which are really just regressive, is that as of 2025, according to the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy, which produces a regular report called Who Pays, right, which basically analyzes the distribution of tax incidents by income band, 38 out of the 50 states have regressive tax systems, where poorer people pay a higher percentage of their income than richer folks, people at the top of the income distribution. On average, the United States, at the state and local level, has a regressive tax system. People in the bottom 20%, the bottom quintile, pay on average 11.4% of their family income in state and local taxes, while those in the top 1% spend 7.2% of their family income on state and local taxes. In some states, this gap gets like absolutely truly nuts. In Texas, talking about Texas earlier, the bottom 20%, which in Texas, we'll clarify here that the bottom 20% in each state varies, like what the actual income threshold is, because certain states are just like have higher wages on average, right? So don't be like wigged out when we tell you like in Texas this is the number, in Florida this is the number, all that stuff. So in Texas, that threshold for being at the 20th percentile of family income is $21,700 a year. And on average, those folks pay 12.8% of their income in state and local taxes, while those in the top 1%, which in Texas is $744,800 a year, so like, I don't know, that's, I think, roughly 30 some times more income, right? Roughly, maybe mid 30s. I'd have to do, I can't do the exact figure in my head, but mid 30s.
We don't do math live. Never do math live.
I could do the math live. I actually kind of want to do it. I'm going to do it right now. People in the 99th percentile of income, making $744,800 a year, are making 34.3 times the amount of money as people in the 20th percentile of income. There we go. Did the math live.
Damn. I'm impressed. Hire this man.
If any universities are listening, do hire me. I can do math on the fly. But so roughly 34 times the amount of income, and they pay just 4.6% of their family income in state and local taxes. In Florida, which by ITAP's measure is the most regressive state in the country, people in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, which in Florida is slightly less than Texas, $19,600 a year. They pay 13.2% of their family income in state and local taxes, while those in the top 1%, those who make in Florida more than $735,700 a year, pay just 2.7% of their family income in taxes. Fully more than 10% less of their income in state and local taxes. The burden of taxation that funds the things that the state of Florida and cities in Florida do falls far more on poor people than on rich people.
Do we have a sense that poor people use more services?
We have this sense, I suppose, but I don't really think that it's true with regards to the things that governments spend the most money on.
Especially
right?
state governments, because most like welfare spending, quote unquote, is money that's coming from the federal government. For states to administer.
So the things that states and cities spend the most money on really is infrastructure and like emergency services type stuff, right? They spend a lot of money on water infrastructure. They spend a lot of money on roads. They spend a lot of money on education, but that's sort of a separate part of the budget, right? That like often gets siloed off differently. But it's not really like poor children are using any more services when it comes to education than rich children, right? At least not insofar as like it's not necessary to make up the funding gaps we talked about however many episodes ago, where because you fund schools through property taxes, schools that have higher property values around them are better funded than poor schools, right? But the long story short here is that, like, not most of the money, but most of the burden of paying for these things, right? Obviously, like 2.7% of $700,000 is more than 12% of $20,000, right? But the salient point is that the burden of paying for these things falls not on the people with the highest ability to pay, but on the people with the least ability to pay. However, despite the fact that the burden of taxation falls most heavily on people with the lowest ability to pay, you have a bunch of, and let's be honest with ourselves, we're going to use an impolite term here, a term that has gotten people in trouble in the past, boomer homeowners in places like Florida and Texas, trying to get rid of property taxes. Megan, this is the part that you asked me to put together this episode for.
That I wanted us to discuss. Yes. Thank you.
Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and just all around great guy, loved by his friends and enemies alike, has advanced plans to put an initiative on the Florida ballot in next year's midterms that would eliminate property taxes on the primary residence in Florida.
Can I say I've got like a side theory about why this is becoming such a thing? Because for many, it's a problem with owing property taxes on a house that you've paid off. And the argument that is made is often, well, you don't really own it if you're still paying taxes to the government on it. Which, by the way, that's sovereign citizenship, quite frankly. Like, that's what you're arguing at this point. But my theory is this. When we pay our mortgages, our property taxes are wrapped into those payments, and they're divided into nice little monthly chunks. And so the first time you're not paying a mortgage every month and your property tax bill comes due at the end of the year and you owe it all up front, you freak out because you are not prepared to see it parceled out. You've been paying this money the whole time, but now it's a problem because you're not being forced to pay it in monthly installments. So quite frankly, the boomers need to be pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and managing their budgets a little bit better. They got to knock it off with the avocado toast.
Yeah, I think this is correct, both with regard to the avocado toast and with regard to the property tax bill coming due at the end of the year, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely like a salience bias kind of thing happening here where
Mm-hmm.
like you don't notice it and so you don't think of it as being that important.
Mm-hmm.
But like also, I just want to say like the idea that you should have to pay property taxes before your house is paid off and then shouldn't have to after the house is paid off is insane to me. Like, there's nothing different about your properties and your relationship to the government depending on whether or not you owe money to the bank.
The bank, I think it's the bank is paying the taxes and then the bank is charging you for the taxes, maybe is how some of this is mentally working for folks. And I do want to say, like, I do know some people who have property who I'm sure are going to be listening to this show, and their property taxes are largely going to lead to them changing their residences and selling their homes. And I do also think that that is also kind of the point of maintaining property taxes. If you are not benefiting from your home and you can downsize, that's not the worst idea in the world.
Yeah, I have two things to say about this before we move on to the why is Florida's proposal so stupid here.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is that, and you alluded to it, quite frankly, to be like perfectly honest, if you cannot afford the property taxes on a paid off asset worth so much that you cannot afford the taxes on it, I don't feel particularly bad for you, right?
That's a pretty good problem to have.
I think it's a pretty good problem to have. And then also, quite frankly, part of this is that we haven't built enough housing, and we're going to talk about this in the back half. But like, if you are empty nesters who are living in a home that has bedrooms you are not using, et cetera, and there is a family with 2 children, 3 children, right? Your home's in a good school district, whatever. We can make up all the scenario we want to here. But just imagine this is a good home for a family, and the family would like to move into this home.
Mm-hmm.
It is beneficial for society writ large that you, as empty nesters, move into a property that is not too big for you, and that this family that needs a larger space for their growing family have access to that home. Like, this is, broadly speaking, socially beneficial.
Yeah.
The tax system should encourage this outcome, right? I understand that individually this is like really annoying. And I feel for people who feel like they are forced out of their homes as a result of property taxes or what have you, right? Like, I understand that it absolutely must suck, right? Having not experienced this myself. I am imagining that it is annoying and that you don't like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also the flip side is that it sucks for people who want to be able to move into a larger space to accommodate their growing family, to have the ability to send them to the best schools, all that stuff that we've talked about ad nauseum over the several like months that we've been harping on this point, right? That also sucks for those people. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're trading off one kind of suck for another kind of suck. And broadly speaking, I think that the second kind of suck sucks more than the first kind of suck. And insofar as the government's policy should be to decrease the amount of suck, that is what it should do. That is what I think should happen. So that's the first thing, right? This might sound callous, but like at a certain point, you're making policy trade-offs, right?
Yes.
Like, and we'll talk in the back half about perhaps one of the ways in which we don't need to make this trade-off quite the same way. The second thing, though, is that there are programs you can do that are like much better than whatever the fuck Florida and places like California and Texas are trying to do, which is basically insulate people from paying property taxes at all, that still allow people to stay in their home if that's really what they want to do. These are called property tax deferral programs. And basically what they do is they let property tax accumulate with you not actually paying it, and then it gets paid off when you sell the property. And so, like, it doesn't deprive the state of much needed revenue, right? Because eventually you do get the property
We'll get
taxes paid,
yeah.
right? And it has the benefit of not forcing people out of their homes in a way that like actually displaces or dislocates them, rather than them making a choice to downsize because they don't want to pay the property taxes, right?
Because the issue tends to be the liquidity. So if you say, okay, we're going to have this, I could see a scenario in which it's very difficult for states to account for when they're going to realize all of that funding. Like that's an accounting nightmare. But I can see the benefit.
Yes, I think like it. There are, tricky things to work around, right, with this kind of property tax deferral scheme. I'll note that you can sort of model it out just based on like how many people typically sell their home in a given year. There are states that have already implemented these programs, and so other states can like take advantage of them, right? Take advantage of their experience to design their own programs. But the long story short is that there's a lot better things to do than get rid of property taxes on your primary residence writ large, right? And I want to be like so clear here. Like I want to be like super clear. We're gonna take a little pause, just so that I can like make sure everyone's paying attention. Florida's plan would make it basically impossible for the state to maintain its current, which is already pretty low, its current level of state municipal services, particularly around education, since that's the primary funding stream for schools, property taxes, without dramatically raising sales taxes. The best estimate that I have seen on this is that Florida would probably have to double its state level sales tax from 6% to 12% in order to avoid what are quite honestly, quite frankly, catastrophic funding losses to basically every part of the state funding apparatus.
In a affordability crisis and a cost of living crisis, we're going to make it harder to buy everything that is currently property taxed, assuming that Florida has exceptions, which I don't know that they do, and that they would maintain those exceptions. We're going to double the tax on everything that you have to consume to survive.
Yeah. This would make what is already the most regressive tax system in the country even more regressive, pawning off the cost of state and municipal services onto those with the least ability to pay for those increased costs. And I'll note here as well that California's experience with basically doing away with property taxes for older homeowners, this is Prop 13. We don't need to go into exactly all of the details about this, but suffice it to say that it means that people who have lived in their homes for a very long time pay way less in property taxes than people who have recently purchased a home, which broadly speaking means that older people pay way less in property taxes than younger people, even if they are living in homes that are right next to each other with exactly the same value, right? This is what Prop 13 does.
Yep.
There are several papers out there that find that Proposition 13 has dramatically slowed the amount of construction in California because of sort of the reasons that we've talked about earlier, where you disincentivize people from selling properties and sort of moving on and doing that important work of like actually freeing up properties that are needed for various things. In this case, properties that are needed for new development to increase the housing stock as the population of the state has grown. And getting rid of property taxes entirely would like do Prop 13 on steroids, right? And as we are well aware, California is not an affordable state when it comes to housing costs, right? A big part of that is Proposition 13. Mm-hmm. And the driving factor, I see a thought on your face there, Megan. Let's before I go into
it does. Yeah, you seem like you were gearing up there. This Florida plan is just a massive cash transfer from young people and poor people to older people and richer people.
Yes, 100%. It is a massive transfer of wealth from younger and poorer people to richer and older people. That is absolutely the way that it works out, just like mathematically, unless you want to have these just catastrophic funding losses. Which I should note, in the wake of Proposition 13, California did experience, right? pretty catastrophic funding losses, to the point where like property tax revenue in the state of California only very recently, in real terms, got back up to where it was before Proposition 13 was passed, despite the fact that there is way more property wealth and way more people in the state of California. What I'm saying here to Florida and Texas, quite frankly, is don't pursue these California policies. Don't California your Texas and Florida. Now, of course, we could talk about how this was a thing produced by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association back when California was a Republican state, but whatever. We'll gloss over that for the present moment. But the driving factor behind a lot of this really does seem to be that there are a lot of people out there, we might call them assholes, who are fundamentally just disengaged from how anything works, don't think that they have an obligation to participate in the ongoing maintenance of the society in which they live, and more generally are pissed off about the fact that they are paying taxes which are hard to avoid, but which carry important economic signals and important funding for the state that they live in. This sense of, I got mine, so I shouldn't have to do anything to pay for you all. With that in mind, let's take a bit of a break, and then we will come back and talk about what we ought to do instead of
this terrible idea.
All of this.
Welcome back. When we left you, we were discussing the terrible ideas had in some quote-unquote low-tax states designed to really increase the tax burden on the poorest among us. And, just how selfish our boomers are, I guess.
Yeah,
not all boomers, but certainly
hashtag not all boomers. I do recall, I don't remember the name of the author of this book, but there is a book called A Generation of Sociopaths, which basically looks at I haven't read this book all the way through, or at least I don't think I finished it. But it's basically the boomers were born into the most prosperous time in American history and then proceeded to destroy all of the things that made that era of American history prosperous.
Wait, and that's the basic premise of the show.
Yeah, so crazy, right? Yeah, amazing. How did we get back to that? Anyway, there are two main things that I want to talk about here in the second half of the show. The first of these is a little bit more wishy-washy, quite frankly. There's no policy solution that will make us do this. But I think that we need to genuinely reframe our relationship and the aforementioned assholes out there's relationship with taxation, just with taxation generally. We're going to talk about that first at a decent length. And then also, I think, importantly, we need to just reorient the way that we do taxation at the state and local level. And there are two sort of subparts here. The first is that the revenue stream should rely on different taxes, especially at the local level. And especially with regards to property taxes, we're going to talk about land value taxes here and why they are superior in almost every single way. Subpart 2, policymakers need to stop changing taxes and just playing with tax rates and all that kind of stuff as their first response to problems that impact the level of taxes that people need to pay, and actually start solving the problem that the tax rates provide us a signal about, right? In other words, you need to stop insulating people from the consequences of their actions that end up worsening their tax situation in the future, right? You need to actually start solving the problem rather than just getting rid of the taxes when they become painful. So, on this first point, we need to either get back to, or because I don't really know whether this sort of civic engagement type of feeling really ever existed, engender a new sense of civic commitment among people. This is what we were talking about way back at the beginning of the episode, right? About this is what living in a society looks like, right? Taxes are not merely what some people call the price you pay for living in a civilized society, right? You may have heard taxes described in this way. I have heard taxes described in this way. Megan, have you heard taxes described in this way?
For sure. And I don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but it still views taxes as a negative thing. This burden that you must shoulder, this task that you must fulfill. And that's just not the right way of looking at it. I've thought of, weirdly, this is bringing up thoughts about ancient Rome, the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire being somebody's actual Roman Empire here. First of all,
very 37-year-old dad of you.
Thank you. No, this is literally, this is a story from a book that I read as like a little kid, some like historical fiction YA thing, where they're telling a story of one of the like big deal Roman guys. He ran the fire brigades, and in order to put out a fire at your house, you had to pay him while your house was on fire. So your negotiating power is like not amazing.
Not amazing.
I think it's very difficult to kind of think of a universe where you find it better to say, I'm not going to pay for the fire department, and I'll only pay if I need the fire department. If you need the fire department, you've really lost any sort of bargaining power you might have had there, and no one else is helping to pay the cost, which is going to be very high to get somebody to come out and put out a fire at your house. You also need people on standby all the time. Who's going to pay for that? You're just not going to have these services that you need if you go to a pay-for-services model, like this ancient Roman scenario. But the other thing I wanted to say is this, because I am kind of wandering off here a little bit. The time of the early Roman Empire, you have rich people competing to build public works because there is a sense that that is what you should be doing with your money. The way that you consume conspicuously is to provide for the public. And we don't feel that way anymore.
Yeah, I think, there's obviously an argument to be made about, like, the relative virtue of, like, rich people's philanthropy versus just taxing it away and spending it using the state. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense in which you can sort of think about, like, we've got Carnegie Hall for a reason, right? Like built by horrible steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, right? Who like did a whole bunch of stuff during the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution, but he built a big public work that is enjoyed by people to this day. And today, the rich people seem to be interested in building, like, I don't know, space companies to get them off the rock, right? Which, like, I don't know, maybe we'll look back at 150 years and be like, that was a good thing for them to do because now we have, like, we can extract resources from Mars or something. I don't fucking know. But it does seem like there's a lack of civic virtue among certain people, right?
If your whole design is how do we avoid taxation as well as possible, that's not you providing for your fellow Americans in this case.
Yeah.
That is not you providing for your fellow people. And I think that is something that we should be prioritizing as something that is valuable. We should want to pay our fair share.
Yes. The upshot of this is that taxes are not, as we said, merely the price you pay for living in a civilized society, for roads and schools and water infrastructure, police and fire, libraries and community centers. They are, and should be thought of as, a manifestation of the civic commitment that we make to each other as citizens of the same country. The commitment that we make that sees people without children pay property taxes to help fund public education, while those with young children help to fund the medical care of people who are old enough to be eligible for something like Medicare, right? I think I have, over the course of doing this show, become more civic virtue pilled, if we can use this expression, right? Like, we ought to relish the opportunity to contribute to the services that characterize a functioning democracy, rather than looking for ways to avoid paying our fair share and trying to cut our taxes because we don't want them to apply to us, because we don't want to pay for services that we do not perceive that we are directly benefiting from. Now, of course, as we alluded to in the front half, there are instrumental reasons to do these things. you benefit indirectly from living in a society where people can read, for instance, right?
Yes.
Just
Yes.
as much as you directly benefit from roads and healthcare and all of that jazz. But regardless of this fact that you do in fact benefit from living in a country that is not filled with morons, you should want to contribute regardless of whatever instrumental benefit you imagine will accrue to yourself, no matter how circuitous its path, because you are also very civic virtue pilled and understand that we live in a fucking society. And that part of living in a society is contributing to each other's well-being.
I think if you have ever looked at another country with frustration or jealousy and thought, why can't we do things like that? The answer is they're willing to pay much more in taxes.
Or at least part of the answer, right?
Yeah, if you want to crush the Finns on the PISA scores, if you want train stations that look better than China's, you need to be willing to pay taxes.
Yeah, you need to be willing to contribute to these things, right? And I understand. We talked about it at the top. There's this whole deal about let's have the rich pay their fair share, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, let's do that, right? But in order to fund the kinds of public projects that a lot of people want, we're going to have higher taxes just on average, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the difference in the amount of income, I think this is I don't remember exactly where I saw this. I'm going to get the figures wrong. But the difference in the amount of money that the average taxpayer pays as a percentage of their income in federal taxes and the top marginal tax rate, the amount of income that you need to make in order to hit that top marginal tax rate, is something like 11 times in the United States, right? Like the average taxpayer makes like the person in the top tax bracket on average makes like 11 times more than someone at like the average level of income or something like that. In places like Sweden and Finland, it's more like 2.5 times, right? Like the top tax brackets start a lot lower, right? They start in what we consider to be the middle class. And yes, there's an argument that we'll talk about. We're going to talk about it in the second half about like just what the proper balance is there. We want to avoid like totally stymieing economic growth, which you can do if you tax people too heavily, right? Like this is a thing. I don't know if we have any like really ardent communists who listen to this show, but broadly speaking, in the world that works on market frameworks, which is basically the whole world because there aren't any actual communists left anymore, if you tax people too heavily, you do decrease growth. We'll talk about that. But insofar as the goal is crush the Finns on international education tests, have train stations that look like they do in China or in Moscow, for example. You got a lot of people post it, like Moscow metro stations, right? Insofar as you want those things, you need to be willing to pay taxes for them, right? And you should want to pay taxes for those things. Because as I said, you are very civic virtue pilled and you realize that we live in a society. All right, cool. We've done that. We're going to do that. That's going to happen. I'm manifesting it. I'm manifesting it. We are going to civic virtue pill everyone. You're going to understand this. Now on to the second part. And this is, I think, a little bit more concrete. We ought to reorient the way that we do taxes at the state and local level. And ideally, I think, even though we sort of mentioned earlier that like often the threats of rich people to leave in response to higher taxes are somewhat of a hollow threat, ideally this would be done in a somewhat coordinated way across states, just to avoid the possibility that the aforementioned assholes don't just do some capital flight and leave places that implement these better taxation systems. Since the taxes that we're going to be relying on here do fall more heavily on the wealthy, because duh, of course they do, right? That's like the whole fucking point, or one of the whole fucking points. I think it's perhaps a little bit necessary to do another brief diversion here to just explain like what the general goals of a taxation system ought to be, in my opinion. In my view, and maybe you disagree with this, Megan, maybe you don't, we'll see based on sort of what I'm about to share. A well-designed tax system has I would say, sort of three constituent goals. These are oftentimes sort of, they press against each other, and so there are trade-offs that you have to make. But in general, you want your tax system to, one, be sufficient to fund necessary state spending, and basically not possible to game, right? Like, you don't want people to be able to avoid taxes through financial trickery, right? That would be annoying. This is one of the criticisms of our tax system right now, that it's kind of possible to game if you get, paid in certain ways, all that kind of stuff. You want to avoid screwing with people's incentives, and you want to avoid deadweight loss. This is sort of the growth argument that we talked about earlier. And you want the tax system to be progressive with respect to income, so that the tax burden falls on those with the greatest ability to pay. This is, broadly speaking, I think, the three principles that, while you will have to balance them, your tax system should be trying to do, broadly speaking.
I would push back gently on the idea of screwing with people's incentives, because there are some times where you want to change the incentives for folks. But as a general matter, I agree with these.
Okay, I would, yes. We can talk about certain incentives being bad incentives that people shouldn't follow. You don't want to screw with good incentives that people have, right? Yeah. Yes, you don't want to screw with good incentives. The reason that these goals can be contradictory is that the third goal frequently conflicts with the second, right? Progressive income taxes are distortionary. They do change people's incentives in a way that is not always amazing, but they are among the most important taxes in terms of avoiding the concentration of wealth, ensuring that governments have enough revenue, ensuring that tax burdens fall upon people with the greatest ability to pay those tax burdens. Similarly, sales taxes, which we talked about at length about how regressive they are not all that distortionary, but you want to avoid relying on them heavily because of the fact that they are so regressive and because they, fall on people with the least ability to pay that tax. The tax that I think, at least we currently use, that best splits this difference while also being largely unavoidable, at least insofar as it is implemented in the first place, is property taxes. But Clayton, I hear you saying, you said earlier that property taxes also work out to be regressive. So why do we like them? Why are they good? Yes, I did say that.
Why are our audience at the bottom of a well and also in a 1930s slapstick comedy?
I don't know, Megan. This is what they sound like in my brain. That's just what the audience sounds like. Maybe
audience, if you're at the bottom of a well, please let us know.
Please save me, please. Anyway,
oh God, it's
yes,
the end
I did
of
say that. I did say that they work out to be regressive. They are less regressive than sales taxes, certainly. But, and hear me out here, this is where we actually start to talk about transitioning our revenue mix. And the main way that we do this, in my view, is transitioning property taxes, which again, we talked about earlier, the biggest single revenue source for state and local governments, from property taxes to land value taxes. Land value taxes are basically a perfect tax, and which is paradoxically one of the reasons why they are often not politically popular, because they are so hard to avoid, right?
You're telling me that people are out there advocating for a tax structure they know they're going to be able to game? That's the point?
Yeah, I know. It's shocking, right?
Okay.
So at this juncture, I do think I need to explain land value taxes once again, just for people who didn't hear our episode with Nia Johnson. The long story short of a land value tax is that it functions very much like a property tax, but is assessed completely on the value of land rather than on the value of the property, like the structure and the land together. Right? You can design land value taxes in such a way that they are revenue neutral with respect to the amount of property tax revenue that you currently collect. And basically you do that by assessing a higher tax rate on the value of the land than it's currently being assessed. The way that property taxes work now, essentially, is the value of the property is assessed with regards to the value of the land and the value of the improvements. And the improvements mostly means people's homes, but not always. It sometimes means the land being improved in other ways, businesses. Sometimes you'll get like actual improvements to the land in terms of like resource extraction, right?
Some people they'll own a plot of land, not put a house on it yet, but you plumb it for sewers and you add an electrical hookup, stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. So those are improvements to the land, right? And all of this at the end of the day gets taxed at one rate. It gets taxed at like an average property tax rate is something like 1%, right? That's a reasonable property tax rate is like 1% of the assessed value. So, for example, if you had a property that was worth $500,000 a year, not $500,000 a year, $500,000, you are paying $5,000 a year in property taxes, right? Now, for the sake of argument, just to make the math easy, right? Let's assume that 100,000 of those dollars is the value of the land and $400,000 is the value of the structure, right? This ratio is like not totally atypical, right, of the value of land compared to the value of a structure in like most American cities. You can make this revenue neutral, right, by taxing just the land at 5%. So the land is worth $100,000, you tax it at 5%, you still collect $5,000 in property taxes a year.
And this issue of revenue neutrality is only an issue as we transition. Once we move to this new system, it is what it is.
Yes, exactly. And basically the reason why we do this revenue neutral thing, and it's not, by the way, revenue neutral with regards to every single parcel. It's like revenue neutral, like just across things, right? So you say, we as a community collected, I don't know, $16 million in property taxes last year. We're in a reasonably sized suburb, right? And that's how much property tax revenue we got last year. We're going to transition to this land value tax system. We also want to collect $16 million. What is the rate at which we need to tax land in order to do that, right? In many cases, this will work out to being revenue neutral for people, but more often than not, it actually results in shifting the tax burden onto wealthier people who own more land, whose land is more valuable. Right? And so while a property tax often works out as being regressive with respect to income, basically everywhere that we've actually implemented a land value tax system, either pure LVT or a split rate system where you tax land at one rate and property at another, you see most people get a tax cut in terms of how much money they need to spend on property taxes, now land value taxes, and it shifts the burden onto the largest landowners.
This makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because if you compare in your head a mental image of a home where a lower income family lives and they have 2 children to a home where a higher income family lives and they have 2 children, the size of the various bedrooms that are required doesn't change very much. But in the wealthier family's home, likely it has a greater square footage, and usually that square footage isn't just straight up, it's out, and there's a larger yard attached to it. So that's going to wind up being a larger parcel of land, which is going to wind up being taxed at the same rate, but resulting in a greater amount of revenue from that larger parcel.
Yeah, and the biggest shift of this, frankly, is onto unimproved land that people own, right? So, or only very slightly improved land, right? One of the biggest things that this is in a lot of American communities is onto parking lots, right? Especially,
it's all a war on parking.
All a war on parking, war on cars. Yes, come back to us. We'll do another episode on this at some point. But this brings us to the second subpart. This is where we need to start talking about this. So we're talking about figuring out this revenue mix, changing to a land value tax, a much better system, right? And I've talked about this at length on other platforms. We don't have time for me to do it in a huge in-depth explanation. Maybe we do a full land value tax episode at some point, just so I can go into it really in depth. But we'll save that until you guys have had a fill of other content, right? So on this second part, property taxes and land value taxes both have this really nice, desirable property of telling us about the value of housing, the value of land and location. When property taxes go up quickly, it probably means that housing is getting really unaffordable for the average person. And this is the signal that most people are receiving, right? As opposed to just, oh, I know that my home has gone up in value, right? It's that sort of negative feedback loop rather than a positive feedback loop, right? And we sort of talked about this earlier about the ways in which property taxes encourage people to downsize, right? They should also encourage people, all other things equal, to want more housing built so that their property doesn't have to increase quite as fast in value and they don't have to pay the same level of property taxes, right?
It should also incentivize you, if you are a person or a business who's sitting on a vacant lot, to improve that lot and get it off your books.
Yes, this is another like really desirable property of land value taxes with respect to property taxes, is that they don't like screw with your incentive to build something at all, right? In fact, they actually directly incentivize putting land to what's called its highest and best use, right? If you have, for example, a surface parking lot in the downtown of a major American city, the land is probably extremely, extremely valuable. But because you are you're taxing that land at a low rate, you're taxing it at, say, 1%, the same as you would tax a much larger structure, right? A much larger building that's put onto that land, the value of that property, right? It basically means that you're paying way less in taxable value than the land is actually worth. There's other stuff about land value taxes here. They really discourage land speculation, right? They like capture all of the land rents. They present absolutely no deadweight loss because you're not going to change the amount of land that you have, right? Based on whether or not land is taxed, right? Even when you talk about land reclamation efforts, right? Like it doesn't really change the incentive. But regardless, if you have these taxes that are increasing, it suggests that you should do something with the land that more accurately reflects its actual value, right? And oftentimes these changes in value and taxation are the result of policies that are maintained by local voters, right? They're a direct result of things like single family zoning or prohibitions on mixed use spaces or on just higher density in general, right? They're result of like people actively showing up and blocking new projects, suing to stop new projects under environmental laws, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Instead of doing all of this, instead of like just building more housing or allowing land to be put to a higher and better use, what we are doing right now, what states and cities are doing, is insulating people from the consequences of their actions in the form of higher taxes by cutting or getting rid of those taxes entirely, while also doing all of the other stuff that we talked about in the first half. We need to do the exact opposite of this. We need to actually solve the problems rather than just getting rid of the consequences of the problems for the people who are causing the problems in the first place. We need to actually respond to the signal by solving the problem rather than removing the fucking signal.
When you put it that way, it seems pretty obvious, honestly. To say that you, especially in the context of property taxes, and this is why I asked you to do this episode, to say, we have this property tax affordability crisis, and to respond that the solution is to eliminate or reduce the property taxes rather than say like, yeah, actually, maybe it's a really reasonable thing that once you no longer need a home of a certain size and at a certain higher value, you downsize, you don't have that property tax burden anymore. You can probably buy that home in cash if you're downsizing enough and your house is paid off. I don't know why we wouldn't want that to be incentivized. And I don't know how we have kind of come to a point where the social norm seems to be that our parents or our grandparents will age in their homes in the same home in which they raised a family as long as possible. We've gotten very attached to our homes in this country. And I think that is going to have a really significant effect on our tax structure unless we take these solutions that you are proposing to heart?
Yeah, there are a couple of things to add on here, I think. One is that like residential mobility in the United States has declined a lot, right? It used to be the case in like the 1960s and 70s that roughly 1/4 of American families moved in any given year. Now it's more like 15% or even a little bit less, right, post-pandemic. We've really, really seen a decline in residential mobility. There are various problems with this. Maybe we'll do a full episode on like reject staying in place, embrace residential mobility or something. But the long story short is we are staying in place more than we used to. And then also, I think one of the reasons why we have this cultural expectation now is because there are a lot more old people than there used to be, both in absolute numbers and as a relative percentage of the population, and a lot fewer young people than there used to be. Again, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of the population. This is why you see like lots of schools sort of getting consolidated, right? It's why you see like colleges that had like smaller student populations, small liberal arts schools shutting down, right? Because the university population is decreasing. And it's not entirely insane to understand why a society that has a lot more old folks in it would develop these sort of cultural convictions around old folks as opposed to young people when there are fewer young people in everyone's lives. And this is perhaps intractable problem, at least over the course of the short term. But yeah, I think like the thing that we're doing is in essence, there's this like fire alarm going off basically in the form of these high property taxes. And instead of putting out the fire by building more housing or incentivizing people to build more housing in a way that will hold down property values, or that will have people, as you are supposed to do when there's a fire alarm, get out of the place that's on fire, right? We are removing the fire alarms, basically. People are saying, that fire alarm is really loud and annoying, and I don't like it. Can you get rid of it for me, please? And we are doing so. So until we do the opposite, until we manage to reorient our relationship with taxation, and until we change the way in which we fund our local governments, to at least in some way or another shift the tax burden away from those with the least ability to pay, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.